Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be testing out a new nib that I got for my Pilot Vanishing point. Right now, it's got an 18 karat extra fine nib in it, and one of my favorite inks is Colorverse Dark Energy. I've been writing with it in this extra fine nib, and it's okay. It does pretty nicely, performs pretty nicely, but I know that my favorite nib so far for this ink is my Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. So I ordered a fine nib for my Vanishing point because I know there's some inks that I like in the fine nib, and I know there are some inks that I really prefer in this extra fine nib, so I thought it would be nice to have some variety there so I could use various inks in this pen that right now is my favorite pen. And since I was going to be testing, I wanted to test this ink in both nibs. I wanted to see how the Vanishing Point fine nib compared to my favorite so far fine nib and the E95S fine nib, and I thought, well, why not compare it to a bunch of stainless steel and gold nibs, various sizes. So I got a selection of everything ranging from a stainless steel extra fine to a stainless steel broad nib, and I thought it'd be interesting to see how they all compare. Before I start testing though, I'm going to show how the nib came. I ordered it from a seller on eBay, got a pretty good deal on it. It's not used, it's new. It came in a padded envelope in this thin cardboard box. It was dented just a little bit, but I'm impressed with how well the envelope and this box protected it. It's sealed in cellophane. Just like the nib that came with my Vanishing point, it's the gunmetal finish, or I guess this is ruthenium plated. I'm not sure, but this is a tiny little nib. But let's start testing. I dipped it a little farther than I normally do for dip tests. I am probably going to get my little sample vial. I have a sample vial of this ink. That will be easier for dipping. I'm writing on Tomoe River paper, and this extremely fine nib is pretty smooth. There is no bounce to it. It is pretty stiff, but pretty pleasant. All right, this is a little bit easier. Whenever I'm dip testing pens and testing inks, I'm usually using a sample, testing a sample, and that is quite a bit easier for dipping, unless it's like a small bottle, like the small Oroshizuku, the little 15 ml bottles, or the small Erbon bottles of ink. That should be good. You can see it's a little bit broader, and the feeling of the nib on the paper was very similar to the extra fine. It's a smooth nib, but very stiff. Next, I've got my Pilot Lucina. It has a stainless steel fine nib, and it's a little bit larger than the nib from the Kakuno and the Prera. Now, there was a little bit of just a tiny hard start there, and that is most likely because I am running on fumes. The only ink in this pen is just the ink still left in the feed. I've been enjoying writing with this pen and or ink and nib combination. It feels similar to the Pilot Gold nibs. There's a little bit of softness. It's not quite as soft as their 14 karat nibs, but you can feel that it's a bit softer than the two smaller nibs, smaller steel nibs. These are these are nice nibs. I've been impressed. Next, I'm going to write with my Pilot Explorer that has a steel medium nib. It's the same type of nib that's on the Prera and the Kakuno. These Pilot medium nibs, kind of depending on the ink, but a lot of times they can be a bit, quite a bit drier than the gold nibs. And I'm not sure if the Lucina comes in a medium nib. I can't remember, but just that bounce gives those nibs lets a little more ink flow. And these stiff steel nibs, I've noticed the mediums tend to look a bit drier. So there are some inks, really wetter inks that I enjoy in these Pilot Steel medium nibs, but this Colorverse Dark Energy feels like it's a really saturated ink, and it feels kind of thick and viscous, and for me this drier nib is just not one of my favorites to use with this ink. And next, I've got the extra fine nib in my Vanishing point, the 18 karat extra fine. The performance is very nice in this nib. I want to see more of the ink. So I'm going to pause the video right here and go swap out these nib units. Okay, I've got the ink flowing. This is the fine nib. Now this, it's not scratchy. It feels the same in every direction, but it doesn't feel as smooth as the extra fine nib. I don't know. I may test it on some other papers, and it may just need to write a little bit. Honestly, I didn't rinse this. I just took it out of the package and started writing, but I do like the size of the line it's putting down. I like the way that looks. Let's see how this compares to my Custom 74 14 karat fine nib. I always find it interesting how ink sticks to some nibs and not to others. Okay, wow, look how much wetter that is. I'll have to compare these two again. Whenever we get done and I've got more room, I'll compare the wetness down here on the bottom of the page. But these two felt very similar. For some reason, I don't know, I just felt like this wasn't as smooth as I remembered the Custom 74 being, but they are very similar. Now, look how You know, the upstroke is drier on the Custom 74 where it's more uniform with the Vanishing point. I'm curious to see how I feel about that in the regular writing. I know this drier upstroke with this smooth nib has always been pleasant to me. I like the character that it gives my writing. I'm curious to see how I feel about that after I've had some experience with it. All right, next I'm going to write with my E95S. Now, it also has a fine nib, a 14 karat fine nib, but it has always written wider than the Custom 74. All right, you can see it puts down a wider line, and it surprisingly seems to be on par wetness-wise with the Custom 74, but it just feels like it's writing so much wetter. Next, I'll be writing with my Custom Heritage 91. It has the same type of nib as the Custom 74. It's a 14 karat number 5 size nib, but this one's a medium. Putting down quite a bit more ink. You can see the upstroke is still a little bit drier than in the other 3 directions, but it's not as noticeable because this nib just puts down so much more ink than it did with the fine nib. And you can see that the E95S looks like it fits just nicely in between the Custom 74 fine nib and the Custom Heritage 91 medium nib. So I would classify the E95S fine nib more like a medium fine. And this is just really smooth. And the last pen I'm going to write with is another Lucina. It has a steel broad nib. Just as wet as the gold medium nib, but I do see a little bit more in how broad it's writing, and no difference in the amount of ink it's putting down in each direction. You can see the upstroke is a little bit wetter than it was with this medium nib, and I've noticed that with the Pilot steel nibs. They tend to write more uniform in every direction, but so do the Vanishing Point 18 karat gold nibs. It's just mainly the number 5 size 14 karat nibs tend to write a bit drier in the upward direction, but they're so smooth that you don't really feel it that much in the writing. It's more you just see it in the character of the writing. All right. I am looking forward to writing with this ink with that fine nib. It puts down just enough. The Pilot fine nibs just suit my size of handwriting. That is just right. Unless it's something like a dark black or blue ink. There are certain inks that I do prefer in that extra fine nib. In fact, the blue ink cartridge that came with it, I loved it. I've never been a big fan of just plain blue ink, but in that extra fine nib, I really enjoyed it. I've been writing a lot with this ink. This semester, I've been helping my daughter with physics. I was a physics major in college, and I've been enjoying using this ink in my Marlman notebook. This color of ink, this may not be an exact duplicate, but it makes me feel like Leonardo da Vinci when I'm doing those physics problems. I think there was maybe a Mont Blanc Leonardo da Vinci ink that people have talked about. I may be remembering this wrong, but I believe I've heard people say it had like a chalkiness to it, a chalky look to it. This ink has kind of I can't really place it. It has a sheen to it, just a subtle sheen. And maybe it's like a silvery kind of sheen, or maybe it's a brassy looking kind of sheen. I just really have always enjoyed this ink. It's been a while now, and I said when I got this pen that this might be the one. I'm kind of feeling like I'm wanting to sell some pens because this is really the only pen I want to use. I've got a couple other pens that I use for different purposes, but this is my main pen right now. I said I was going to compare the wetness of these two one more time where I had more room. The Vanishing Point and the Custom 74. Not super wet, but it feels like a wet writer. I guess because it's so fine. And the Custom 74 fine nib. It's noticeably wetter. Let me compare smoothness one more time. I can hear the scritchy scratch, and I feel feedback, but it's not in any way scratchy. Same thing, I hear the scritchy scratch, and this time I felt less feedback. It's the Vanishing Point is smoother than my Custom 74, and it's not significantly noticeable. I had to compare them side by side. If I used one day and used the other one the other day, I don't know if I would notice it. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.